Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Ashen Souls, Fallen Hearts in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 21, Futures Decided. Which leaves the Lords Illadur, Matthias, and Clymen. Matthias began to explain. We believe they, as well as many powerful Western lords, were accomplices in the assassination of the late king. Along with the Grand Duke, they seem to have received large sums of money and supplies from the imperial nobility. Thinking this to be recompense for the assassination in Duskur, we investigated the link further. In 1171, the mage Cornelia arranged for a certain powerful imperial family to come to the kingdom. Dmitri nodded along as the report continued. It was later in the evening on the day of Rufus' execution, and the Prince of Faerghus had flung himself headfirst into as much work as he could get his hands on. If he stopped to think for too long, he was going to end up straying in a direction he would rather not let his thoughts go, so he instead busied himself with everything he could across the kingdom. It was hardly the best way for him to come down from the high of his uncle's execution, but there wasn't much else he could do. He knew there was work to be done, and he wouldn't push back against that, especially if it would get him out of his own head for a while. That's the year when my step-uncle, Lord Arundel, brought Edelgard here in exile, Dmitri hummed in response to Matthias. He hadn't thought much of his relationship with Edelgard recently, too busy with the opening weeks of his school year at the Officers' Academy to think much of their history. She didn't seem to recognize him when they spoke, so Dmitri could only assume she had forgotten the past. Either way, he didn't want to think about it. The last thing he needed was another rabbit hole he could accidentally fall down head first. Correct. We think Lord Arundel and his followers were behind the matter. They have deep ties to the imperial household, a household that has been shown to be full of corruption these last few weeks, Matthias went on. The Knights of Syros were sent in part to the Empire to defeat an uprising there led by Lord Arundel himself. I can only imagine he had been planning this for quite a while before the assassination. He was no doubt involved with Cornelia's work here in the kingdom as well. As I suspected. Dmitri murmured. He wished he could have said he was at all surprised to hear the imperial household had something to do with the death of his father, but he wasn't shocked in the slightest. Given how deep the rot of corruption sunk in the imperial capital, this just felt like a natural deduction. He didn't like it, but he didn't like most things that had taken place over the last week or so. What was one more thing for him to despise? You are a clever man, Margrave Gautier. Well done. Matthias simply bowed as he pressed one hand over his heart. Thank you, Your Highness. If we continue wringing information out of them at this pace, we'll soon have a clear picture of what transpired, Rodrigue remarked. He had one hand cupped around his chin as he thought through everything they had learned, a small frown on his face. Unfortunately, we won't be able to question Lord Arundel about the matter at hand. He vanished after the attack in Inver, and I doubt he would be willing to talk to us even if we approached him. Most likely not, Matthias agreed with a shake of his head. But we can figure out what happened even without him. He made his decision, and we can move onward regardless. My uncle's attendants must also confess to the slaughter in Duskur, Dmitri said. But now that things have come this far, we can't expect the Western lords to stay silent. We need a way to keep them far from power. He hadn't expected to be staving off a civil war as soon as his uncle was executed, though he supposed he shouldn't have expected anything less. Rufus didn't intend to leave Faerghus without a fight. Matthias let out a snort, his mind clearly drifting in the same direction. Oh, there are always ways provided you are willing to keep all your options open. Dmitri stifled a sigh at that, hating the outside confirmation of his worst fears. Yes, I suppose so. Let us speak more of this later. For now, spread word of what you have found to every palace and pub in the land. That should help keep the lords in check. It was hardly the perfect way to keep the Western lords from making any grabs for power, but there was nothing Dmitri could do to stop them at the moment. Faerghus had suffered enough as it was, and the entire nation had been weakened by Rufus' attempted coup. Even if Dmitri had wanted to get rid of the Western lords and he definitively didn't want to wage war against the nobles of his homeland, he wouldn't have been able to. Gilbert frowned at that, his entire face falling with the thought. Is that wise, Your Highness? If we announce that Rufus was involved in the tragedy of Duskur? The silence that fell over the throne room was a heavy one, and Dmitri admittedly did not know how to respond. He didn't know what people would say if they heard Rufus had been involved with the murder of the king, but Dmitri refused to keep the truth from them for any longer than he had to. After all, they had been hurt by the assassination too. It wouldn't be right to keep the truth hidden. I will not feed my people half-truths, Dmitri eventually settled on saying. They deserve to know. I've always admired that candor, Your Highness, yet such news is sure to create a degree of unrest in the kingdom, Matthias pointed out with a heavy frown of his own. So you suggest we bury the truth? Dmitri questioned, and Matthias floundered under the weight of the question. Should it somehow come to light, the people's faith in me will be forever shaken. If the kingdom is ever to part ways with our bloody past, this is the path we must walk. Honesty is what the people deserve, and this is what we need to share in order to grant them that peace. Fine words, though I doubt they'll appease the people of Dusker who were hurt so deeply by the tragedy years ago, Gilbert pointed out. Nor the rest of Fairgus, many of whom will not be so quick to forgive. They will remember what happened no matter how desperately you wish to move forward, and you must be prepared to face that. Ha! We thought you might say as much, which is why His Highness and I have devised a solution, Rodrigue began. Dmitri already knew what he was going to say next, but he doubted anything could have prepared him to actually say it. I will resign the title of Duke and pass it to my heir. Spare me, Rodrigue. One person with wild ideas is already one too many, Matthias retorted. It's not wild at all, Matthias, Rodrigue countered with a strangely grand smile and a shake of his head. People will seek to point the finger of blame at His Highness for what happened years ago even though we know him to be innocent. If he begins his rule in a state of unrest, then we will be setting ourselves up for disaster. The best way to mitigate the damage done by Rufus, Arundel, and their conspirators is to create a diversion. Matthias questioned with a scoff. You make it sound so lowbrow, Rodrigue sighed. I intend to work with Didi to restore harmony between the people of Fairgus and Dusker. Unfortunately, this will be a full-time job, and I cannot afford to split my attention between two important matters. Felix will take up my current position while I attempt to smooth things over between our people and those of Dusker. He offered to spend his life to set things to rights, Dmitri supplied even though he wasn't entirely certain about if this was the best course of action. Still, desperate times called for desperate measures, and Dmitri knew better than to push back against Rodrigue on something like this. He was confident Rodrigue was acting in the best interests of Fairgus even if it wasn't the outcome any of them had asked for. It would at least do something to help, and Dmitri had to take what small blessings he could get. Gilbert sighed at that, his dissatisfaction clear. He knew he couldn't have said anything to try and change Dmitri's mind though, so he instead decided to go along with it. In that case, we've only to deal with the issue of the throne. I believe we should move forward with your coronation straight away. I agree, Dmitri nodded. My time at the Officers' Academy was a valuable experience, but I belong here now. Obviously Felix won't be able to return either. Fairgus needs us both. Have him come to me later so I can deliver the news and an apology. I've already had a word and told him what must be done. You've no need to apologize, Rodrigue assured him. Dmitri just sighed. Yes, I have, he murmured, though he shook off his self-loathing before it could fully set in. As for you, Gustav, you'll also be staying here in the kingdom. Gilbert sputtered at that, unable to hold back his surprise at being referred to with his actual name. Dmitri wondered if Gilbert had thought he was actually fooling anyone by changing his name or if he was just hoping no one would call him out on it. Either way, it mattered little as Gilbert tried to muster together an objection. But I abandoned my homeland. There can be no place for me in Fairgus. I will make a place for you, Dmitri interrupted. His voice went soft and fragile when he next spoke, albeit against his will. I need your help. Lady Rhea will understand. Please, Gustav. I need you. Gilbert was once again caught off guard by that, and he paused to think about it before he responded, his eyes falling shut along the way. It would be my great honor, Your Highness. Send word to the Church and the Lords, Count Galatea will be in charge of contacting the South, Dmitri declared. He took a small breath before continuing. Now there's another topic I'd like to discuss. I wish to reorganize my army. Since I have you all assembled, I'd like to hear your suggestions. Rodrigue thought about it for a moment before he cracked a smile that told Dmitri his next suggestion wasn't going to be anything any of them wanted to hear. I may have a proposal. You can't be serious. The Blue Lions were gathered together in a meeting room of the Fhurdiad Palace, all of them facing Dmitri. Felix was the one who had spoken, his face twisted in disgust. He had already been told of what he needed to do next just as Rodrigue had said, but not even Rodrigue's previous apology could have fully made up for what Felix was going to hear next. Dmitri had been expecting Felix's distaste, but he still had to hold back a wince at the venom with which Felix spat the words in his direction. I'm afraid I am, Dmitri replied. Because of the recent unrest in Fairgus, we need to turn our attention inward where the army is concerned. There were many who turned against us to fight alongside my uncle, and even if some of them have since backed down, there are concerns of disloyalty among our troops. The best way to mitigate a concern like that is to employ the strongest people I know as our generals. But we're not fit to be generals. Annette cried out in protest. We're only a few months into our time at the officers' academy, and even if we were there for a full year, I don't think that would be able to give us the experience we need to fill a role like that. You all fought admirably in the battle here in the capital, and even those of you who weren't here have still proven themselves potent fighters on our previous missions with the church, Dmitri told her. I would not be extending this offer to you if I didn't think you were capable of handling these positions. We need to completely reform the army for the sake of ensuring everyone involved is loyal to Fairgus, and I know of no better people than all of you to fill those gaps. None of us would be able to return to the officers' academy if we took you up on this offer. Ash murmured. Then again, I suppose you, Felix, and Dida wouldn't have been able to come back either way. I don't know what we would do if we went back without you. I don't want to pressure any of you into doing something you don't want to, Dmitri declared. This is still your decision at the end of the day. However, I would be honored to name all of you as my highest-ranking generals if you would take the positions. I'll do it, Ingrid said as she took a small step forward. I know this may not have been what any of us expected, but we can still make the most of this. Besides, our home needs us. Fairgus needs us. It wouldn't feel right for me to return to the monastery after all of this. I want to do what I can for my country, and if that means venturing off the beaten path, so be it. We're living in unprecedented times, so we need to be willing to do unprecedented things. I should have known better than to think you'd have the sense to turn him down, Felix muttered as he pinched at the bridge of his nose. What about the rest of you? Are you going to stay here, or are you going back to the monastery? I don't think I would be able to go back to Gareg Mach knowing Fairgus is undergoing an entire reconstruction effort without me, Sylvain confessed. You're all going to be doing a lot of hard work here, and I can't walk away from that in good conscience. If you really need my help, then I'll do what I can to offer it. I feel the same way, Ash chimed in. I can't say I agree this is the best idea given how little experience we have, but if you want me to stay here, then I'll do what I can. It feels like the least I can do. I suppose that settles it then, Mercedes finished with a smile before she turned to Annette. How about you, Annie? Are you going to stay here? Annette's face was overcome with a sudden wave of conflict, 1,000 thoughts raging through her head at the same time. She stammered a few times in an attempt to get the words out, but she couldn't quite figure out the way forward. In the end, she closed her eyes and nodded. Yeah. I'll stay here. Thank you so much for your help, Dmitri told the Blue Lions. I don't think I could ever say it enough. Your help will be much appreciated here in the capital. I'll do all I can to support you in your new positions and ease you into this life. It may not be easy, but I appreciate each of you agreeing to do what you can for the good of Fairgus. I suppose that settles that then, Sylvain declared as he stretched his arms high above his head. We've got a coronation to prepare for, and we have to pick up all our things from the monastery too. I feel bad for whoever has to tell Lady Rhea one of her classes for this year won't be returning. I have no doubt she will understand, Dmitri assured him with a shake of his head. Though I do agree that we have to return to Gareg Mach briefly for the sake of picking up everything we brought with us in the first place. We can do that once we've ironed out the rest of the details regarding where we are taking this journey next. Let's get ready then, Ash smiled. This work won't do itself. For the future of Faerghus. Dimitri allowed himself a small smile as well. For the future of Faerghus. Annette sat down on the bed in the room she was granted for her time in Fhirdiad, a heavy sigh escaping her lips along the way. She let her hands come up to cover her face, and she pressed down against her closed eyes until stars appeared in her vision. Afterward, she allowed herself to collapse backward so she was staring at the ceiling above. Normally, she would have relished in the sensation of the mattress beneath her, but instead, she was focused a bit too much on everything else going on in her life. To be more specific, Annette was thinking about her father. Gilbert had finally admitted to being Gustav, and he would be staying in Fhirdiad for the sake of working with Dimitri after his coronation. That should have been good news. Annette was staying in Fhirdiad too, so they would be able to see each other as much as they wanted. But that was the problem. Gustav didn't seem to want anything to do with her. Annette hadn't been able to work up the courage to confront him about why he left yet, but she knew the conversation was coming. She couldn't escape it forever. Annette had been nervous about staying in Faerghus to begin with because of him. She didn't want to do anything that could potentially upset him, but she couldn't just stay away from him forever either. She needed to reach out and try to make things right. But what was the point if he didn't want to do the same in return? She had wondered if perhaps it would be for the best if she went back to the monastery until she was able to smooth all of this out, but she didn't want to stoop to his level. He had left, and she refused to follow in his footsteps regardless of how worried she was. Annette didn't want to do that to anyone, and that included herself whether she wanted it to or not. A knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts, and Annette sat up slowly. She knew her hair had to be a mess from her dramatic collapse onto her bed, but she didn't bother with fixing it as she instead strained to listen for who was waiting for her outside. Maybe it was Gustav there to try and talk to her about everything. Wouldn't that be a terrifying twist of fate? Annie. Of course not. Come in, merci. Annette called out. She did her best to comb through the flyaways that had escaped her twin-looped ponytails, though she quickly discovered that wasn't going to be as easy as she would have liked. She winced at this revelation and forced herself to set her hands in her lap to look at least somewhat composed. Mercedes walked inside at Annette's instruction, a small smile on her face. I had a feeling I would find you here, she said. I wanted to talk to you about everything going on. You didn't seem to want to stay in Fhirdiad when we were with the others before. Annette did her best to stifle a groan, though she couldn't keep it entirely hidden no matter how hard she tried. Was it that obvious? She muttered as she once again pressed her face into her hands. So much for seeming casual and composed. The instant anyone called her out on how she was really feeling, all of that fell apart. Maybe not for everyone else, but I know you too well to not see it, Mercedes told her as she sat down beside Annette carefully. She gave the other girl all the space she needed to leave in case that was what she wanted, but Annette remained still. Mercedes hesitated for a long moment before she continued. You've been thinking about your father, haven't you? Yeah, Annette admitted when she realized hiding the truth wasn't going to have much of a point. I haven't been able to get him out of my head ever since we first went to the officers' academy, and I've been thinking about him even more since we came here. I want to stop thinking about him, but I just can't. What are you going to do? Mercedes asked gently. You're going to be here with him for quite some time. Do you think you'll be able to talk to him about everything that happened when you're ready? I have no idea, Annette confessed. I don't know if I'll ever be ready. I want to just walk up to him and ask why he left me and my mother behind, but I know he's not going to give me an answer quite so easily. Of course he won't. Mercedes remained quiet as she tried to come up with a response to that, but Annette continued before she had the chance. I know why he left. He felt ashamed after the tragedy of Dusker and the death of the previous king. He thought he was responsible for it by not being there to help. But doesn't he see that this isn't helping anyone? He's just punishing himself, and in doing so, he's dragging me and the rest of our family down too. He can't just run away from us forever. I don't care how disgraced he feels to the rest of the kingdom. I just want my father back. You deserve that much, Mercedes nodded. I wish I could say I understood why he left you, but no matter how many times I've tried to make sense of it, I've never quite been able to come up with an answer. He didn't have to walk away from us like that, Annette sighed. We didn't care about his honor or what he may or may not have done that day. I care about him because he's my father. I want to be with him because he makes me happy. Why is that not the right answer for him? The room fell quiet for a long time, and Mercedes hesitated before responding. I don't know, she admitted. I think you deserve better than what he gave you, but you also deserve to make things right if that's what you want. It's your decision to make, Annie, and I trust you to be able to make the best choice. If that means talking to him, then I'll be there to support you every step of the way. Annette thought about it for a long moment before she forced herself to shrug. That's the problem. I don't know what the best option is here, and I don't know if I ever will, she confessed. I wish it was that easy, but I don't want to talk to him, but at the same time, I really do. Above all else, Annette forced herself to stop. She wasn't sure where her mouth was going, but she could already tell it wasn't going to be a direction she liked. It was probably going to end up being something uncharacteristically mean, and that was the last thing she wanted to deal with on a day when Fergus was already in crisis. She had more important things to do than focus on her father and the feelings he brought up. But Mercedes believed otherwise, and she leaned a little bit closer with a frown on her face. You. What? She prompted, though her voice was gentle enough to tell Annette she could leave the subject alone forever if that was what she really wanted. Just like always, Mercedes was giving her space, and Annette appreciated it. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough to stop her from speaking, the words coming out in a hurried flurry before she could hold herself back. I don't understand why he came back because His Highness asked him to, but he would never come back for me no matter how many times I asked him, Annette said. As soon as she spoke, her cheeks went pale and her eyes went wide. She couldn't believe she had actually said that. She had been right, the next words to come out of her mouth had been much meaner than she could have ever intended. It wasn't as if Annette held anything against Dmitri for this. Of course not. He was a good person, and Annette wouldn't dare to say otherwise. But she couldn't help being a bit jealous. Why was it that Dmitri could approach her father and ask casually if he would stay in Fergus from then on and have it come true when Annette had to avoid Gustav constantly? Annette doubted any conversations she started with her father would have ended in her favor even if she tried to approach him. The fact that he was avoiding her at all spoke volumes, and it hurt like a stab to the chest. Annette didn't want to hate him just as she didn't want to hold anything against Dmitri. In fact, she still didn't hold anything against Dmitri since it wasn't his fault Gustav had decided where to place his loyalties and his priorities. Annette just wanted to understand. Why wasn't she enough of a reason for Gustav to come home? Why was it that Dmitri had to ask him in order for Gustav to finally make a change after he left his old life behind? Why couldn't Annette do anything to help her father when he decided to turn his back on her? Oh, Annie. Mercedes whispered. I'm sorry. I wish there was something I could say to make this better, but Annette shook her head, ignoring the tears she knew were starting to spring to life in her eyes. It's fine. It's not like you could have done anything to change this, she said. Annette sighed and shook her head. I guess I just want to understand. Why doesn't he want anything to do with me? Did I do something wrong to push him away and just not realize it? What can I do to make all of this right somehow? It was his choice to leave you behind, Mercedes reminded her. I don't care what you think you could have done back then. You were a child, and a child is under no responsibility to look after their parents at such a young age. He was the one who made that decision, and if it hurts you, then he should be the one to make up for it. If only he agreed, Annette murmured. But I guess there's nothing I can do about it now. We're both staying here in the capital, and that means we have to try and talk to one another eventually, right? He can't just run away from me forever. Do you think you'll want to try and talk to him soon? Mercedes asked. It's your decision to make, and I'm not going to push you into doing anything before you're ready, but maybe it would help you to take that weight off your shoulders. It shouldn't be something you need to carry around to begin with. I'm not sure, Annette confessed. I guess I can cross that bridge when I get to it. For right now, I'm just going to do my best to make the most of this. Even if I'm not the happiest with him at the moment, I can't get too caught up in it. We've got new positions in the army now, and I'm going to do my best to be ready for it. I'm glad to hear it, Mercedes smiled gently. But don't try to carry everything on your own, all right? I don't want you to get hurt because you took on too much. I know you have a habit of getting a bit in over your head. Annette opened her mouth to protest, but she realized a moment later she had no ground to stand on. In the end, that was enough of a revelation to make her laugh, and she shook her head as she allowed her tears to finally melt away. Thanks, Merci, she said softly. This means a lot to me. I'm happy to help, Mercedes replied. Now, why don't we go and get some food? I think you could use a bit of a pick-me-up, and the best way to do that is to get something in your stomach. Maybe we could even get some dessert afterward. I think we've earned it after the week we've had. Annette nodded her agreement as she pushed herself to her feet. She still felt a bit shaky after her recent emotional turmoil, but she was able to keep herself upright, and that was what mattered most. She was willing to do whatever she had to as long as she was able to push through long enough to enjoy the sweets Mercedes had promised. The older woman was right, they had earned it. Even if Annette hadn't been there for the battle against Rufus, her struggles with Gustav felt like they applied for suitable compensation and then some. This was just the start of a new era for them as well. This was the first day of their lives as generals of Faergus, and none could say just what was waiting for them at the end of this road. Annette was going to do her best to face it with a smile, though regardless of how her father was treating her. She owed it to herself to try and make her future something worth fighting for, and she was more than happy to give it her all. It was a new start, and there was always some good to be found in something like that. Chapter 22, Trials Come in Threes. Garreg Mach was empty. Claude couldn't exactly say he was surprised by this though. The Knights of Syros had either gone off the Empire to take care of some political turmoil in the capital or followed Dmitri to Faergus to put down a coup the Grand Duke was trying to incite. There were only a small handful of defenders left behind at the monastery for the sake of security, though Claude wasn't entirely sure if that would be enough to defend Garreg Mach if something actually happened. He wasn't necessarily hoping for that, but he couldn't help worrying a little bit about just how few people were in the monastery. It made sense. The people in the church were trying to keep the truth quiet for the sake of not causing too much distress across Fodlan, but Claude was too smart to end up distracted by something like that. He knew there was more to this than they wanted him to see. The attacks in Adrestia were not simply a matter of political turmoil, as others had claimed before this. In truth, the regent was being arrested for treason. He had managed to escape, something Claude heard whispered among the few Knights of Syros who were still there for him to listen in on the first place. Edelgard had been crowned as the new emperor as soon as it was revealed that her father had been killed by Arundel in the chaos of the battle. The Black Eagles were with her as they sorted out what they were going to do with their future, but times were still tense. The people of Adrestia wouldn't be able to get a break for quite some time, and that much was clear even in the other regions of Fodlan. Somehow, Faergus was in an even worse state, and that was certainly impressive given the circumstances. Rufus had decided to incite a rebellion against Dmitri, though nobody could quite figure out why. If Claude had to guess, he would have said it had something to do with what was going on in the Empire though. The timing was just too perfect for that to not be the case. Rufus had probably started to fight after he realized what was happening in Inver, though Claude still hadn't figured out how those two ideas were connected. Either way, Rufus had been executed, and with his death, Dmitri had been given the chance to ascend to the throne. He was waiting on his coronation as Claude sat there in the officers' academy courtyard, and soon enough, he would be king. To say a lot had happened was an understatement. The entire foundation of Fodlan had been thrown into chaos with the events of the last few weeks. The empire and kingdom would never be the same, and Claude could feel it. He had no idea what this was supposed to mean for him, but he was willing to be patient to see. As far as he could tell, Rhea was at just as much of a loss. She hadn't expected everything to deteriorate quite so quickly after Edelgard left the monastery, and she didn't know what the protocol was for something like this. The students of the Officers' Academy had never been forced to abandon their studies because of such dangerous circumstances, and figuring out what to do with that was a headache and a half. In the meantime, Claude was enjoying his relative break from regular class work. At the time, the idea had been to wait a little bit so the Golden Deer weren't too far ahead of the other classes when they return. That had been the plan when the Blue Lions had to leave for Fhirdiad. Now, it seemed like they wouldn't be coming back at all, and the same applied to the Black Eagles. That left Claude's class in a sticky situation. He liked to think he was a master tactician who could see anything coming in a fight, but this was certainly out of the realm of what he had expected. Claude had been under the assumption everyone would be spending the entire year at the Officers' Academy, but instead, 2/3 of them were leaving after just 2.5 months. There was a twist for the ages. It was a nice day at Garreg Mach, and Claude could at least appreciate that. In fact, if he wasn't dealing with a massive crisis of what his life was going to be like as the only house leader left at the Officers' Academy, he would have enjoyed it. Instead, he watched the sky overhead with a small frown as the clouds rolled by. He wished he had an answer for where to go from here. This was far from anything he could have ever expected, and he had no idea what to do about it. The good news though was that Lester wasn't in any kind of crisis. That was certainly a blessing Claude wanted to relish in. The last thing he wanted was to have to fight through attackers in his own territory when the other two countries were in enough danger as it was. At the very least, one country out of Fodlan's 3 knew some degree of stability. That wasn't a great record, but it was something, and Claude liked it. That was less stress for him, and it gave him more time to enjoy the lovely weather. Claude. Somehow, he should have known it was going to be too good to last. Claude eased his head back into a normal position as he sat up to his full height. He had previously been resting the base of his neck against the back of the bench behind him, but the sound of Lawrence's voice was quick to pull him out of his daydreams of a better life. Claude couldn't help but smile at the sight of the other boy, noticing just how thoroughly ruffled Lawrence looked. People could call Claude cruel for it all they wanted, but he couldn't help but derive a little bit of laughter from the sight of Lawrence when he got flustered. What could he say? It was entertaining, especially with his strange hairstyle Claude had never seen on anyone else. Lawrence didn't give Claude the chance to offer him a snarky comment though. Instead, he came to a stop just in front of the heir to the Alliance, heavy breaths racking his lungs and upper body. "You must come quickly, Claude. We have an urgent message from House Goneril," Lawrence cried out. Claude winced inwardly at that. Yeah, he was definitely right about this being too good to last. He should have seen it coming. The next hour was a whirlwind of activity. Claude was dragged up to the audience chamber by Lawrence, and Hilda was waiting for him there. Seath had received a message from Holst recently saying there was a massive force amassing at the border between Leicester and Almira. Somehow, Claude wasn't surprised to hear that. Given what was happening in other parts of Fodlan, it made a lot of sense. If there was one thing Claude had learned about Almira, it was that they were competitive. They loved the thrill of combat, and that was likely what had driven them to attack the locket this time. The timing was once again a bit too perfect for Claude to feel comfortable. If he had to guess, news had gotten back to Almira about what was happening elsewhere in Fodlan. With the Knights of Syros split between Inver and Fhirdiad, the monastery was less protected than ever. They wouldn't be able to offer meaningful support to the locket if Holst decided he needed reinforcements. Beyond that, the invaders no doubt assumed the chaos in Fodlan would spread to Leicester with time. If Adrestia was in chaos from the escape of the regent and Faergus had just seen its temporary ruler executed, then it wouldn't exactly be a far cry to assume Leicester would be the next victim of disaster. Even if there wasn't anything bad happening in the Alliance, the distractions in the other nations meant nobody would be able to come to their aid if Leicester was invaded. Just like what had happened before, the attack on one country led directly to an assault on another. The chain had extended this time to Leicester, and Claude hated just how smart it was. He was admittedly impressed, but he didn't like this in the slightest. As it turned out, the other Golden Deer didn't like it either. They had gathered together in their classroom as soon as the news broke, and Claude hated having to be the one to share the truth. It was his duty as their house leader, but he despised it regardless. Everyone's faces fell nearly on the spot. The last few weeks had been difficult enough for them as it was, and this was a cherry on top of the world's worst cake. I can't believe the Almiran army is invading, Leonie exclaimed. She was resisting the urge to pace, instead just tapping one foot against the ground in a desperate bid to rid herself of lingering energy. As far as Claude could tell, it wasn't working at all. And with the biggest army since Fodlan's locket was completed. Hilda cried out. This was the most stressed Claude had ever seen her, and that was jarring for more reasons than he could count. My brother's preparing to intercept them, but he's outnumbered big time and needs all the help he can get. House Regan stands ready, but we can't my grandfather expect to lead an army, so I guess it falls to me, Claude said. He had surrendered to this fate the instant he heard about the attack, but it still found new and inventive ways to give him a headache. I wish I knew what the other Alliance lords will do, but there's no time to call a round table. I have no doubt my father has already leapt into action, though I will likely be the one who ends up on the front lines, Lawrence declared. House Ordelia is close, so I like to think we've already sent reinforcements, Lysathea supplied. Sadly, I expect little help to come from my adoptive father. I'm sorry, Marianne murmured, wringing her fingers together anxiously and refusing to look up to meet anyone's gaze. That's fine, Claude assured her. I actually have a different favor to ask Margrave Edmund, but we can chat about it later. I don't understand the reason for this sudden act of aggression, Ignatz confessed with a shake of his head. If this really is the biggest army since Fodlan's locket was completed, that's a century's worth of battles. Is this invading force really larger than every previous attack in the last 100 years? Maybe the Amirans figured it's now or never, since the Empire and Kingdom are wrapped up in their own problems. I mean, we're pretty much the only students left around here now, and the Knights of Syros are mostly split up too, Raphael pointed out. Yeah, I heard something about a coup in Inber and a revolt in Fhirdiad, Leonie chimed in. Both are serious problems that don't directly affect the Alliance, Lysathea frowned. And even if word of Fodlan's troubles has reached the Amirans, it doesn't follow that they'd start a war. It has nothing to do with us, at least not yet. Well, that's assuming they have all the information, which seems unlikely, Claude pointed out. If all they heard was something vague like war in the capitals, it might make them more likely to invade. We don't even have all the information about what's going on in Inber and Fhirdiad right now, so I somehow doubt the news of the conflict managed to leap over the border. They probably only know the vague idea and thought now would be the best time to attack. We need to try and fix this as soon as possible, Hilda announced. If they manage to get through the border, we won't be able to ask for any reinforcements with the knights so busy. If we don't have time to call for a round table, then we need to take the fight directly to them. I'm impressed, Hilda, Claude remarked with a loose smirk. This might just be the most proactive I've ever heard you talk about anything. You must be really excited about this. I'm excited about nothing, Hilda countered with an aggressive sigh. I don't want anything bad to happen to my brother, and if that means going to the locket, then so be it. I'll do what I have to for his sake. I want him to be safe. Are we just going to leave for the locket then? Ignatz questioned. I don't know how much the 8 of us would be able to do if we went to join the fray. We're nowhere near as experienced with fighting as other trained soldiers, and I don't know if it would make a difference. We need to at least try to help though, Lawrence pointed out. For all we know, this could make all the difference in winning the day. We can't allow them to overrun Leicester, especially when we don't have the means to push them out once they cross the border. We must push them back before then, and that means joining the fray as soon as possible. Besides, it won't just be you. Claude turned at the sound of a new voice, and he was met with the sight of Shamir standing in the doorway. She was one of the few Knights of Syros who hadn't been sent out on either mission, and since she wasn't strictly involved with the Knights as most others were, she could easily get away with joining the Golden Deer on their journey to the locket. That was the assumption, at the very least. Shamir? Leonie questioned, her eyes going wide. What are you doing here? I'll be joining you for the battle at the locket, Shamir replied. The church may not be able to lend you an army right now with the Knights of Syros stretched thin and spread out, but I'm coming with you at the very least. My arrows will make short work of Almiran Wyvern riders. So we get to see what the knight's best archer can do with a bow? I won't say no to that. Claude whistled with a smile. He was quick to ground himself though, and he offered Shamir a smile. I'll be counting on you as well. Can we go now? Hilda interjected, her voice edgy with impatience. We're not going to be able to do anything for my brother as long as we're just sitting around here, and I would rather not twiddle my thumbs any longer than I have to. We should have our preparations completed by the end of the day, Lawrence declared. Afterward, we can set off for Fodlan's locket. Claude nodded at that. He certainly hadn't expected this to be how the day ended, though he would have been lying if he said he was at all surprised. If the people of Almira had only heard vague whispers of conflict in Fodlan, then it made sense that at least someone would want to swoop in and take over Leicester while everybody was distracted. The best thing he could do was try to fend off the invaders even if it wasn't what he would have wanted. At this point, his desires didn't matter much. He needed to keep Leicester safe as its future Archduke. Chaos had come to all of Fodlan, and Claude was going to rise to the challenge no matter what it took. The journey to the locket was both all too slow and much too fast at the same time. Hilda hadn't been able to calm down ever since the Golden Deer left the officers' academy, and that constant edgy anxiety was enough to distort time for all of them. Her paranoia was tragically contagious, and before Claude knew it, everyone was worried about the potential of an Almiran invasion. They knew they would all be at a disadvantage even if they fought from the defensive standpoint of the locket. That was simply a fact of life when it came to battling Almira. That was perhaps the most curious thing of all when it came to the church in Claude's opinion. Of course, he would never be able to say so openly without arousing the suspicion of at least 5 people in the monastery, but he couldn't help thinking about how overwhelmingly easy it was going to be for the Almirans to break down the barrier and cross over into Fodlan. They had far more technological advancements, and they were better fighters too. Claude had learned that ages ago, and he always kept it tucked away in the back of his mind in case the information was ever relevant. When Claude had first come to Fodlan, he had expected a land of power given that they had such easy access to the crests. Even in Almira, everyone knew about the power of the crests, and the military knew better than to underestimate something like that. A bit of time and observation had told Claude that there was much more to Fodlan's situation than just power brought by the crests and their respective relics though. The entire continent was far weaker than Almira ever had been, and the navy of Almira could destroy any port town in Fodlan in a matter of days. Fodlan was hanging on by a thread, and the crests and relics were their lifeline. That was the reason for the construction of Fodlan's locket in the first place. It was much easier to hold down a defensive point than to try and take the advantage through sheer force of will, so the people of Leicester constructed a fortress for the sake of fending off invasions. It had worked well enough up to that point, though Claude didn't know if it would hold out forever. This was bound to be the strongest attack Fodlan had ever seen, and that was going to be a headache and a half to deal with. It was in times like these where Claude couldn't help but distrust the church even more than usual. He had noticed many things about Fodlan since coming to live there, and the main observation among them was just how isolated the continent was from the rest of the world. The people remained in their happy little bubbles of 3 countries and 3 countries alone, advancing only as much as the church allowed them to. If Fodlan had been allowed to flourish the same way as Almira or even Bridget and Dada, for that matter they wouldn't have needed to worry about outside invasion at all. Instead though, Fodlan remained stubbornly locked in the past for some reason Claude had never quite been able to figure out, and that stubbornness was the greatest enemy of the day. Almira was a country focused on military might, and they could crush Leicester any day as long as the winds blew in their direction. It would have been a one-sided fight without the locket and the students of the Officers' Academy, the 2 final lines of defense against Almira's provocations, and even with those benefits, Claude didn't know if they would win the day. As much of a pain as all of this was, it struck Claude as interesting in a morbid way he would never admit to anyone else. He had always known Fodlan was behind the rest of the world in terms of individual advancements, but this seemed like the culmination of it all. The church had declared that Fodlan would remain stuck in the past in an era of crests and relics, and the people had complied since they knew no other way. Claude couldn't help but wonder if perhaps the people of Fodlan could learn a thing or two from the Almirans. After all, taking power and inciting rebellion could be for the best every once in a while. Of course, Claude didn't want them to have to learn that lesson through forceful invasion, so he prepared for the battle regardless. He knew where he had to stand in this battle, and he wouldn't back down for the sake of his people. He wanted to make connections in times of peace, but that meant surviving long enough to reach peace in the first place. Unfortunately for him, that involved combat, though he was willing to deal with it if that was what the world required of him. Claude brushed one finger across his bowstring to test the tension before he began to adjust the weapon slightly. He had done this countless times over the span of the last hour since the Golden Deer had made camp, but he never quite seemed to find the composure he needed. Instead, he was reminded time and again of just how little he wanted to do this, and that left him even more wound up and tense than before. He knew what had to be done, but that didn't mean he liked it. The rest of the Golden Deer were off doing what they had to for the sake of preparations as well, scattered throughout their admittedly threadbare camp as they tried to keep themselves calm. The lack of reinforcements from the church was making everyone anxious, and Claude would have been lying if he said it didn't upset him as well. He had always known the kingdom was the church's favorite out of the three countries regardless of whether anyone wanted to admit it or not, but he had never expected to see it in action quite like this. Claude didn't necessarily like the church since he was certain there was more to it than met the eye, but he wanted them to at least help in times of need like this. He could dislike an ally and still want them to fight at his side for the sake of keeping his country safe. Claude sighed as he set his bow down and pushed himself to his feet. He shoved his tent flap aside as he stepped out into the rest of the camp. The night sky was clear as could be overhead, and the air was a bit too humid for Claude's taste. The lack of wind was the biggest concern. A massive tempest would cause issues for the opposing Wyvern riders, but if the air was still, they would have an advantage when the battle began. Weather was one thing Claude couldn't account for, though he was going to do his best to work around it. He needed to come up with a plan as soon as possible, though that would likely need to wait until after his nerves left him alone. He hadn't been able to let his anxiety go since he left the monastery, and all his bitter thoughts about how great a disadvantage they were at did nothing to help the matter. Claude would be fine though. He was sure he would figure something out no matter what that meant. The Golden Deer, Lester, and his dream were riding on his decisions the following day, and he was going to rise to the challenge. Disadvantages had never stopped him before, and they wouldn't stop him today either. He hadn't come all this way just to be stopped by something like circumstance. And soon enough, the world would know it. Shay stood on the balcony outside her room in the Adrestian castle, leaning over the railing as her hair blew in the breeze around her. She had been busy these last few days as Edelgard transitioned into power and the entire empire prepared themselves for the years of rule she would enjoy from then on. Shay had a large part to play in all of that, and she knew better than to let herself be caught up in her own exhaustion. The empire needed her, and she could feel it deep in her chest. But there was more to it than that. Recent news had reached the empire from Faerghus and Lester that told of attacks against both of the other nations on Fodlan. The Grand Duke of Faerghus had taken up arms against his nephew, and he had been executed for it a short while ago. Edelgard and Hubert seemed to know something else about it they hadn't shared with the rest of the group, but Shay was smart enough to pick up on it. There was someone in the kingdom that had spurred this attack after hearing about the lack of peace in the empire. The timing was no accident. And the same applied to everything happening in Leicester. Shay had never felt a particular connection to her homeland, but she couldn't help her anxiety at the thought of an attack knocking at the Alliance's door. Ordelia territory was close to the border with Almira, and even though Shay hadn't been back to the village she was raised in since she had left to become a mercenary, she still worried for the people she had left behind. They deserved better than all of this, and she wished there was more she could do to help them. It can't be helped, Arvel pointed out, and Shay closed her eyes as had become habit whenever Arvel spoke to her. When Shay's next came into focus, she was in the land of Cosmos and Floating Stone, and Arvel was floating a few feet before her. We just need to trust the Golden Deer to be able to defend the people in Leicester. I know, Shay sighed. Still, I wish there was something more I could do to help. It's nothing I can fix since we're here and wouldn't reach the Alliance until after the battle had already ended, but it's unfortunate. Maybe so, but you have duties to fulfill here too, Arvel said. You've been promoted to an incredibly important position in the Empire, and I can only imagine this will be the source of security you've been searching for all these years. It's certainly nice, Shay nodded. But I can't help feeling a bit tense. There's still so much that's out of our reach and out of our control. After all, Lord Arundel managed to escape, and the same applies to Dimash and Kronia. We don't understand much of anything about our powers even after all the people we've run into that have the same abilities we do. The Empire is in chaos even if Edelgard is doing her best to change that. The people are still scared after what happened with Lord Arundel. And security will bring them the peace they need. Right now, the best thing you can do to help people is to give them a routine they can follow and count on no matter what, Arvel told her. Just focus your attention on the future, and everything will work out. I have faith in that much. You're right, Shay agreed, though she would have been lying if she said she believed it completely. There was still a piece of her that hesitated, that feared something would end up going wrong before she had the chance to find her footing. She would just need to wait and see what the future had in store for her, but that did little to mitigate her present anxiety. There's more to it than that too, Arvel went on. You'll be able to continue tracking down the Ashen demon after all of this. Once the Empire is in a better position, you should be able to divide your attention to finding her again. After that, all you need to do is track her down and get revenge for everything that happened before. Shay winced. If I'm being honest, I almost forgot about her, she murmured. That sounds terrible after everything she did to me, but I don't know. I guess I've been a bit distracted with everything else going on here in the Empire. I've been so busy all the time, and I haven't had a moment to stop and think what I'm going to do after all of this is over. I guess this has been the perfect distraction from all my previous nerves about facing off against her. But there will be time for you to get back to that search after all of this, Arvel reminded her, something like dissatisfaction creeping into their voice at the idea of Shay having forgotten their previous vengeance plan. The disappointment was gone as quickly as it had appeared though, and before Shay could inquire about it, Arvel's tone had returned to normal. For now, I think we should get some rest. I don't know what's going to happen here in the Empire after everything that happened in Faerghus or how Lester is going to factor into all of this, but we need energy if we're going to find out, Shay finished for them with a nod. You're right. I'm getting kind of tired anyway. Let's head to bed. With that, Shay opened her eyes, and she was back on the balcony in the Imperial Palace. She sighed at the darkened skies overhead before turning and heading back to her room. She closed the doors behind her and drew the curtains together, blocking out all traces of moonlight as she got ready for the night ahead. Shay barely noticed anything she was doing though, too focused on the world around her to bother with her own trivial tasks. Fodlan hadn't known a period of chaos like this since well before Shay was born. She didn't know what she was going to do in response to all of it, but that was a question for the next day. Until then, Arvel had a point about her needing to rest as much as possible. That was much easier said than done, but she would figure it out one way or another. She owed that much grace to her future self. And so, Shay settled down for the night, her eyes fluttering closed as the world faded away. The future was another question, and she could ask it later. Until then, it was time for peace, and she would enjoy it while it lasted. Chapter 23, Clash at the Border. The wind blew firmly through Shahid's hair as he looked up at the fortress lining the border of Leicester and Almira. He had been watching Fodlan's locket for what felt like an eternity by now, but nothing out of the ordinary had happened. The attack hadn't yet begun. Shahid tapped his foot against the ground below and resisted the urge to cross his arms. He needed to keep his hands free for the moment the fight began. After all, he needed to prove his worth today, and that meant being ready to fight at any given moment. Shahid's irritation was on the verge of boiling over when he heard footsteps approaching from his right. He turned to face the newcomer, already having figured out who it was through the patterns of the footfalls. I gave you an order, Nader, Shahid snarled, his eyes hardening into a glare. Nader, for his part, remained unbothered by Shahid's obvious rage. He had been working with the Prince of Almira for years up leading to this point, so he knew exactly what to expect and how to deal with it. With that in mind, Nader offered a reply. Yes, sir, you sure did. Then explain why we remain on this side of the mountains staring at that wretched fortress. Did I not command you to gather enough soldiers to push through? Shahid snapped. He would have thought this would be an easy affair. Fodlan had managed to hold the locket for years leading up to this point, but how much did that really mean in the long run? Almira had superior fighters both on the water and in the air, and if it truly came to war, then Almira would win. Nobody had managed to break through the locket in the past, but Shahid was determined to be the first. It should have been child's play. The fact that the fortress had remained unbothered for so long was a disgrace in his mind. Yes, and I did all that. We actually have the numbers advantage by some margin, Nader said. As per usual, he was able to keep his voice even easily, something few could manage when faced with the air of Almira. But the enemy commander, Holst, is a born leader, and his men are bound to fight like demons. Shahid let out a snort at that. He had heard of Holst many times, as had everyone else who entertained ideas of pushing through the locket, but that didn't necessarily mean he was impressed. Nobody from Fodlan could ever impress him as far as Shahid was concerned. I'm sorry. Are you suggesting some cowardly savage is a superior commander to me, the next king of Almira? That was enough to make Nader backpedal, though his hesitation was slight compared to how most others would have responded in the face of Shahid's temper. Not at all, not at all. Nader assured him, doing his best to calm Shahid with his tone. Merely pointing out that storming a fortress tends to be one of those time-consuming sort of things. In which case, the current state of affairs proves to be exceedingly fortunate for you, Shahid smirked darkly. As we speak, the imperial household fights to hold power against the empire's nobility, while the whole kingdom bickers over who should wear the crown. There will be no reinforcements here. Take whatever time you need. I admire that optimism. But as I recall, the king instructed us not to attack yet, Nader said. His confidence was starting to waver more and more as he faced Shahid's shortening fuse, but he did his best to keep his composure. The last thing anyone wanted to do in Almira was admit weakness, and Nader knew that just as well as everyone else. That was before the situation changed. Father will hold me in great esteem for this, mark my words. Shahid promised Nader, and the older man hid his doubt for the sake of not stoking the flames of Shahid's impatience. Luckily for him, Shahid had already moved on to thinking about something else by now, and a frown stained his features immediately. Also, Khalid has been absent for a good while now, and I wager he's plotting some mischief. But once I've conquered Fodlan, it won't matter what folly he attempts. The throne will be mine. That was the main reason Shahid was doing all of this. It had been a few years since his younger brother vanished, and as far as Shahid was concerned, that was a good thing. He and Khalid had never gotten along, and he was fine with that. Shahid couldn't believe his father had moved on so quickly after the passing of his mother, much less that he had taken a woman of Fodlan as his bride. Khalid had been the product of their marriage, and the national distaste for him was clear from the start. Shahid had been named as the heir to the throne years ago, even before his brother was born, but he was nothing if not thorough. He would do everything he needed to in order to secure his place on the throne. If that meant attacking Fodlan and ensuring his brother never tried anything again, then so be it. That was a sacrifice he was willing to make, not that it was much of a sacrifice if it would give him an extra push to get that much farther in the world. If Nader had any questions about Shahid's intentions, he remained silent about them. Even if he had wanted to speak, he didn't have the chance before an Almiran soldier appeared beside the duo. The soldier saluted to his commanders before offering his report. Prince Shahid. Enemy reinforcements have been spotted. What? Shahid roared. He had been under the impression the entirety of Fodlan was in a state of chaos. How could there be any reinforcements to the locket when two of the three countries were in a state of chaos? Beyond that, the alliance needed to call round tables and meetings before they acted at all, and that lack of speed was what Shahid was counting on. It seemed as if he had underestimated his opponents, and he absolutely despised having to admit that. Are we going to retreat? Nader questioned. It wasn't an accusation, instead just a mere inquiry. If there were enemy reinforcements, then that had to change their plan at least a bit. Or so one would have thought. Shahid was quick to brush off any concerns of abandoning the attack though. He scoffed and shook his head. No matter. There can't be more than a scattering of them. Send in the remainder of our troops and crush them all. The messenger nodded before he dashed off to issue the command to his fellow soldiers. It didn't matter if Fodlan had reinforcements to the locket. That wouldn't be enough to save them from a massive invasion. Shahid knew this was the best chance he was going to get, and he wouldn't let it slip away so easily. Even if there were reinforcements on the other side of the battlefield, Shahid would do all in his power to claim victory. After all, he was the next Prince of Almira. How could he ever fail in his mission? Fodlan's locket made its home in the mountains on the border of Leicester and Almira, and the fortress looked proudly over the lower ground on both sides of the border. To say it was an impressive feat of architecture was an understatement and then some. The locket had been enough to protect Leicester from Almiran attack countless times over the last century, and given how much of an advantage Almira had in terms of sheer military advancements, that was something to be proud of. House Goneril had always looked over the border between Leicester and Almira, waiting for the moment the enemy showed any signs of stirring or jumping at Fodlan. The current heir, Holst, was among the strongest House Goneril had ever seen, and he accomplished all of that even without a crest. To put it simply, Claude was impressed by the man, and he was looking forward to seeing him for the first time in person for this mission. Claude had never been given the chance to speak with Holst despite the many reasons they would have had to cross paths. There was simply too much going on for the both of them as the heirs of their respective houses, and they couldn't just put their duties aside if they wanted some time to socialize. In many ways, Claude would argue that the only good thing to come out of all this was being given the chance to meet Holst. He wanted to take a measure of the man's strength himself, and the best way to do that was to be there with him to watch the way he fought up close. The trek up to the locket was a long and arduous journey unfortunately, and the golden deer didn't like any of it. They were careful to start the path up to the top of the peaks as early as they could in the morning so they could afford a bit of time to rest from the journey before the battle inevitably began. The Almiran attackers were bound to be dangerous, and they would have the advantage up in the air. Meanwhile, it was difficult for the people of Fodlan to travel up to the locket on some of the narrow passages that required a person to be on foot rather than horseback. Claude was impressed with the overall construction of the locket, but he would have been lying if he said he wasn't at least a little bitter the person behind its design hadn't thought of making a better pathway to get there. Either way, the golden deer were able to make it before the battle began. Claude kept his eyes on the sky whenever he could, checking for any signs of wyvern riders from Almira, but luckily, he was always met with nothing. That wouldn't remain the case forever, and he knew that all too well, but he wanted to enjoy this peace for as long as it lasted. Once the battle began, he wouldn't get any time to breathe at all. Soon after the group arrived at the locket, they were escorted by a handful of soldiers to one of the upper ramparts that overlooked the Almiran side of the border. A single man stood there looking out over the grounds below, his arms pressed behind his back. Claude could already tell who it was. The pink hair of House Goneril was difficult to miss and impossible to mistake for anything else. Holst turned around with a smile on his face like he didn't have a care in the world. Claude knew better than to believe something like that, but he still admired Holst's confidence if nothing else. "Thank you for traveling all the way to Fodlan's locket. I am Holst Sigiswald Goneril, and I am in command of defense here," Holst declared. Claude bowed at that with a sly smile of his own. "Claude von Regan. I've heard a lot about you over the years. We're here to help you hold the locket in whatever small way we can." He held back a comment about how they were probably only going to be capable of a few small things. After all, the Almiran wyvern riders were powerful, and there was only so much a handful of students could do against a trained fleet when they had no backup to speak of. Once again, Claude wished Leicester had been chosen as the favorite nation of the church. That certainly would have made his life a lot easier now, even if dealing with them was bound to be a pain later down the line. "Ah, House Regan's new scion. I've heard a fair bit about you as well. I'm impressed you were able to scrape together this many troops in so short a time. Duke Oswald has clearly chosen his heir wisely," Holst smiled as he looked at Claude from head to toe. Oddly enough, Claude didn't feel like he was being overly scrutinized throughout the process at all, not that he was complaining about that. Luckily, Holst moved along to focus on the other golden deer after a few more moments of contemplation, his face breaking out into an even greater grin. "Also, I can't express my gratitude enough at seeing so many young people offering to serve. Whoa, look at the muscles on you. Your regimen must be epic," Raphael beamed as he took a step toward the general. Holst seemed to practically glow with the compliment, his already impossible smile somehow growing even wider. "Oh, I'm Raphael Kirsten, by the way. Nice to meet ya, Holst. Lawrence had a far less enthusiastic reaction to Raphael's openness than Holst, and his face twisted with appalled rage. Claude couldn't help but wonder if Lawrence was going to turn bright pink and start blowing off steam like a kettle for a moment. Do not address him so casually, you oaf. Lawrence eventually settled for exclaiming, though his rage remained all the same. This is General Holst, one of the Alliance's finest and bravest warriors. Raphael winced at that, though he seemed more upset by Lawrence's rage than the blunder he may or may not have committed. Lawrence composed himself as he turned to face Holst once again before bowing carefully to the man. Well met, General. My father sends his warmest regards. So we're gonna fight alongside a famous general? No pressure there, Leonie snorted as she shook her head. She was clearly resisting the urge to reach for an arrow and twirl it between her fingers just for the sake of having some kind of distraction. She forced herself to remain still though, flickering her eyes to the sky a few times just like Claude. His anxiety was contagious, it seemed, as much as he hated to admit it. Unfortunately, the next thing to come out of Ignaz's mouth proved that and then some. Yes, I know when I'm out of my league, and I am clearly way out on this one. Maybe I should go back to the monastery, he said. His words were starting to blur into one another from his anxiety, and Ignaz glanced back at the path down the mountain. Going down wasn't going to be much fun given how much of a pain it had been to arrive at the peak of the summit in the first place, but he seemed to find it to be preferable to the battle ahead. And I as well, Marianne agreed. She hadn't been able to stop fidgeting ever since the group set out for their journey up the mountain, though if Claude was being honest, she had been anxious long before that. Her fears had started to run rampant as soon as the Knights of Syros were sent off to handle other business in the other nations, and Marianne hadn't quite recovered since then. It wouldn't be out of the picture to say that none of them had recovered, as a matter of fact. Lysithea let out an irritated sigh at that. Enough, both of you. This is no time to be cowards. Our enemy's just over there. Are you gonna hide like field mice, or will you find some courage and fight? She asked. She pinned both Ignaz and Marianne to the spot with her glare, and the pair looked away for the sake of not accidentally provoking her rage once more. Neither Ignaz nor Marianne had known Lysithea for long, but they still knew it was in their best interests to not make her upset if they could at all avoid it. Holst gladly broke through the tension with a bold laugh though, and that was enough to drag Lysithea out of her intensity. Your classmates are a real colorful bunch, Hilda. I like 'em, he remarked, elbowing his sister gently. Hilda was no doubt used to his raw strength, but she wound up stumbling from the force of the motion regardless, yelping slightly as she did her best to regain her balance. Thanks, Holst, she remarked. She had been standing right next to him ever since the group arrived at the locket, relishing in the comfort he provided just by being there. The love Holst and Hilda had for one another was clear, and Claude couldn't help but wish he could mirror it. Unfortunately for him though, he knew where this invasion, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Hilda was quick to snap out of her affectionate trance though when she looked up to the sky. At long last, the blue expanses overhead had been covered with the wings of wyverns, proof that the attack was finally about to begin. Hilda gasped at the sight and pointed one finger up at the intruders. But if we're all done catching up, we might want to focus on the enemy army that's headed right for us. Holst let out a laugh at that, unbothered by the attack thanks to his admittedly impressive confidence. So they are. The sight of your forces clearly lit a fire beneath them, he remarked. Ignaz and Marianne once again shifted nervously on the spot at that, and Leonie held back a wince at the thought. Fortunately, the locket is impregnable, which they'll soon discover the hard way. Good luck, all. I'm counting on you. To battle. With that, Holst charged off, and Claude watched him go as he reached for his own weapon. He couldn't say he was looking forward to this battle at all. He had been told countless times that the fortress was impregnable, but that didn't do much to ease his fears. After all, he knew firsthand what an advantage the Amirans had as long as they were in the air, and the fortress didn't matter much to them as long as they were flying above it. Beyond everything else, Claude didn't want to be there when the locket was finally breached for the first time. Nothing could ever maintain its win record forever, and Claude hoped with everything he had that he wasn't around when something finally snapped. He didn't have much of a choice at the moment though, so he twirled an arrow between his fingers before dashing off to another segment of the fortress. He had an advantage against the enemy wyvern riders. As long as they were in the air, he would be able to fell them with a few arrows. In fact, about half of the golden deer had an advantage here. Wyverns were weak to arrows and magic, and those were weapon specialties among Claude's classmates. He had no idea if that would be enough to lead them to victory, but it would at least be something, and he was happy to take what he could get. It was fairly easy for Claude to get a read on what needed to be accomplished throughout this battle. The heart of the locket was at the back of the fortress on the Fodlan side of the border. As long as they could protect that stronghold, they could consider the locket theirs. That was bound to be much easier said than done, of course, but it was still feasible, and Claude could work with that. Traveling up through the mountains on foot was difficult for the Almirans as well, so there would be more wyvern riders than anything else, with every other enemy type just acting as a supplemental reinforcement. If the golden deer could turn the foot soldiers back before they broke through the rest of the enemy line, then they would be at a great advantage. Those that could attack from range could shoot down the wyvern riders, while the others handled those that were coming up from the other side of the mountain path. Of course, all of that would only ring true if the enemy commander didn't find a way to make Claude's life a hell of a lot harder, and he already had a bad feeling about that specifically. He could make a pretty good guess about who was responsible for this, and he hated having to think about it. Claude knew he wouldn't be able to run from his past forever, and even if he had just temporarily stepped away from Almira for the sake of accomplishing his goals, he knew nobody from the other nation would see it that way. To be more specific, Shahid wouldn't see it that way. It had been a long time since Claude saw his older brother, but he knew what Shahid thought of him. His brother believed he had run away like a coward, not that he was upset by that at all. In fact, Claude being gone made Shahid's life much easier. He could take advantage of his younger brother's absence to seize more power in the Almiran capital, not that he necessarily needed to push Claude out to claim extra strength to begin with. Claude knew what people thought of him, and Shahid had always been at an advantage as long as they were being placed against one another. This entire battle had Shahid's signature written all over it. He wanted to use this as a chance to gain the respect of the Almiran people. The culture there was all about combat and victory, and if Shahid could finally breach Fodlan's locket, then he would be a hero unparalleled throughout the country's history. With the other nations of Fodlan caught up in their own issues, he would be able to swoop in, claim Leicester, and earn all the glory that came with it. Claude had to admire the plan to some degree, but that didn't mean he was going to let Shahid succeed. He wanted to make peace between the two countries he hailed from, but he couldn't exactly do that if Almira decided to trample over Leicester and destroy it. Claude was silently glad the people of Leicester hadn't ever made an attempt to do the same to Almira. Unfortunately, he couldn't remain caught up in his own relief for too much longer. The wyvern riders overhead were steadily advancing on the locket, and Claude knocked an arrow on his bow as he turned his attention skyward. If Shahid wanted to start a fight, then Claude would be happy to finish it. He preferred to avoid bloodshed, but by this point, that ship had already sailed. He would rise to the challenge if that was what was required of him. After all, peace could only come if he was able to reach the day of deliberations to begin with. Claude took in a deep breath, pulled the bowstring back as far as it would go, and let his arrow fly. And so it begins. The golden deer split themselves up to the best of their ability to cover the massive fortress, though maintaining all that ground was much easier said than done. Their melee fighters remained at the front of the locket to handle the ground forces while the archers allowed themselves to retreat. That should have made the battle much simpler. In theory, it made things easier. However, that did little when compared to just how many of the enemy attackers could fly. A strong majority of the Almiran attackers were wyvern riders, and it took more than just 2 or 3 arrows to bring them down. Almira's soldiers were incredibly powerful, and they knew how to handle themselves in even the darkest of battles. They would not be defeated as easily as the Leicester army would have liked, and that much was becoming increasingly clear as the minutes crawled on. Holst had taken up his leading position at the front of the locket so he could fight off as many of the enemy infantry and cavalry as possible. If he could send them back where they came from without even letting them into the labyrinth of the locket, then that would give the Leicester army the upper hand. It was a small blessing, but it would at least do something in their favor. Or so everyone hoped. Holst was strong, but he was still overwhelmed by the raw numbers the Almiran army had at their disposal. Hilda, Lawrence, and Raphael had offered Holst backup, and they fought through the waves of reinforcements with everything they had. Each foe took multiple hits to defeat though, and the armor of the Almiran armor was far stronger than it had any right to be. They were far more advanced than the people of Fodlan, and the fact that they were there at all was more than enough to prove it. The skies had darkened considerably over the course of the last few minutes thanks to the sheer numbers of the Almiran attackers. No commanders had shown themselves quite yet, but it was just a matter of time before they made themselves known. After all, the armor of these invaders was indicative of more than just the nation's advancements and strength. The steel held the symbols of the royal family, a sign that this had been an order from the very top of Almira's military hierarchy. This wasn't just a regular raid. This had come from someone aiming to tear the world apart. Claude couldn't particularly say he was surprised. He knocked another arrow on his bow, forcing his fingers to move as fast as possible for the sake of keeping himself alive. There were too many soldiers attacking at once for him to have the time to think, but his mind chose to race anyway. The fact that the enemy soldiers were wearing armor marked with symbols of the royal family meant one of 3 people had ordered this invasion. Claude only knew he needed to suspect one person though, and he didn't like the thought of it at all. It had been a while since Claude last saw his brother, not that he was shocked at all to conclude Shahid was the one responsible for this. Just because it was true didn't mean Claude had to like it. His relationship with his older brother had always been complicated, and Claude had left it that way gladly. He didn't want to cause unnecessary friction that could come back to bite him later, so when he left, he did so unannounced and without speaking to his brother. Claude hadn't thought much of Shahid since then, though clearly a lot had happened in his absence. Shahid wouldn't have planned an attack against Leicester without a reason, after all. Then again, even if Shahid had a reason, Claude didn't think it was a good one. He could imagine where this had all come from, and he had figured that much out ages ago. With Adrestia and Faergus in a state of chaos, it was obvious just why the attack had been timed the way it was. Then again, the rationale behind the attack didn't matter much if it was going to end with Almira finally breaching through the fortress for the first time ever. Claude would just have to fight through it and find a way to end this as soon as possible. Claude couldn't help but wonder if perhaps it would be best for him to speak with Shahid directly to try and stop the attack before it could spiral out of control. He didn't think it was going to work given the fact that Shahid probably wouldn't recognize him, and even if he did, talking had never been enough when it came to Shahid's short temper and desire for greater glory. When Shahid set his sights on something, he did whatever he had to in order to get it. That was a behavior Claude had come to emulate over the years for better or worse, albeit to a lesser extent. He wanted to show Shahid what he had learned from their interactions, but he knew it wasn't going to be that easy. Even if he was able to speak with his brother, it probably wouldn't be enough to end the fight. Shahid was stubborn, and speaking with Claude wasn't going to be enough to reverse his bold decision. Claude didn't like the idea of having to fight against the soldiers of Almira, but if Shahid wasn't going to give him any other choice, then he would do what was required of him. There had to be some other way out of this battle though. Or so Claude wanted to hope. Shahid couldn't have pulled off something like this alone. Even if he was the crown prince, there must have been some other force pushing him onward so he could wage war like this at all. Maybe Nader was there. Claude had always gotten along well with Nader back when he was still living in Almira, and that would hopefully be enough to make this battle a little bit easier. Granted, that was still an uncertain factor depending on if Nader was there at all, but with the skies swarming with wyvern riders seeking his head, that was a chance Claude was willing to take. Until he could come up with a full strategy, he needed to stay focused on the battle ahead. He would be fine if he just breathed and kept his eyes on the sky and an arrow in his bow. That was something he could do. Claude may not have liked this situation, but he was fine with pressing through it as long as it would give him a chance to fulfill his ambitions. It may not have been what he expected, but he would endure the same way he had so many times in the past. In the meantime, he just hoped Nader was there, and he hoped his inevitable confrontation with Shahid was as painless as possible. Hope didn't do much to help him out in the middle of a fight, but what other choice did he have? It was something, and he would take that. Chapter 24, A Continued Struggle. Leonie aimed her bow at the sky and let another arrow fly. A moment later, Ignatz released an arrow of his own, and the air shook with the cry of a wyvern as it spiraled to the ground. Ignatz winced at the sound, but he didn't have time to think much of the lives he was taking. Nearby, Leonie was completely unbothered by the cries of the wyverns overhead, and she got right back to the fight again a moment later. Ignatz wished he could be as focused as her, but he knew that wasn't going to happen. Her extra experience was too much for him to catch up to at the moment. Leonie let out a hiss as she sent out her next arrow. "There are so many of them," she cried out. "I don't know how we're supposed to fight all of them off when there are hundreds of wyverns coming down on us." "The best way for us to stop the attack would probably be to defeat their commander," Ignatz suggested. "But we don't know where to find them. As it stands, the best thing we can do is just keep the enemy forces at bay, but I bet I know exactly who we can consider the commander." Ignatz nearly jumped out of his skin at the sound of Shamir's voice behind him, but when he turned around, he forced himself to be calm again. Shamir was struggling considerably less with keeping the wyvern riders at bay, and she found a time to glance over at Ignatz and Leonie through it all. "There's a well-known commander from Almira who fights on the back of a wyvern. I can only imagine he's the one behind this," Shamir went on. "His name is Nader. I somehow doubt the enemy forces would be able to manage such a large attack without him. So if we find this Nader man, we can end all of this?" Leonie asked. She thought about it for a moment before correcting herself. "Or to be more accurate, we can slow down the enemy reinforcements." "It's the best plan we have right now," Shamir replied. "I don't know where he's going to be though, so I would advise proceeding with caution. You'll know who he is when you see him. In the meantime, stay out of trouble." Before Ignatz or Leonie had the chance to ask for any other details, she knocked another arrow and walked off to take care of the next wave of enemy reinforcements. Ignatz sighed as she left. He couldn't say he was surprised by Shamir's sudden departure, but he wished she had offered a bit more information. That was hardly easy in the midst of combat, but with how awful Ignatz's nerves were, he was desperate for any kind of extra information he could get to make this easier. He had expected to come to the officers' academy to learn how to fight, not to be used as the first line of defense against an international invasion. "Nader. That's who we should be going after when we get the chance," Leonie repeated to herself. She nodded to make sure the words set in before she sent another arrow flying skyward. She let out a small yelp as a wyvern swooped close over her head, and Ignatz followed up by attacking the dragon before they could knock Leonie off her feet fully. She sent him a shaky smile before she forced herself to focus on the rest of the battle. Ignatz did his best to keep his attention on the enemies swarming around him, but that was much easier said than done with how many wyverns were making themselves known overhead. It was like Almira's army had an infinite number of reinforcements. In fact, he wouldn't have at all been surprised if that was at least somewhat close to the truth. If they were throwing their entire army at the border, then they were determined to claim success in this invasion. The battle wasn't going to be easy, but Ignatz didn't want to let that stop him. He needed to defend his country no matter the stakes, and he would give it his all. He would hold out for as long as possible until Nader made himself known and was taken out of the battle. Hopefully, the rest of the group was faring at least marginally better than he was. That would at least mean something good for their odds of victory. Right? Hilda didn't think she had ever had a worse time in a fight. All things considered, she shouldn't have been surprised. In fact, this made a lot of sense. She had heard many times about just how strong the Almiran army was, and when push came to shove, she realized that every rumor she had ever been told was beyond correct. They were powerful, and she had no idea how to fight them off all at once. Hilda slashed her axe with as much force as possible at a lancer that dared to get a bit too close to her. She shattered his weapon in half with the strike, but that didn't stop him from trying to go after her again. Instead, he just raised the half of his weapon that had the spear tip on the edge and made to stab her. Hilda let out a light squeak as she tried to dodge the attack, but luckily for her, she didn't have anything to worry about. Holst had appeared between Hilda and the soldier just in time to block the attack with his sword. He completely ignored the disadvantage he was at through his weapon type and kicked the enemy soldier in the stomach. Hilda winced and looked away as Holst finished the job a moment later. She was better at combat than she gave herself credit for openly, yes, but that didn't mean she wanted to see anything overly gruesome. No matter how good of a fighter she was, she remained squeamish and admittedly inexperienced. "Are you all right, Hilda?" Holst asked as he fell back into place beside her. He looked worried, and a small smear of blood had spread across his cheek. Given how many enemy soldiers he was cutting through without even batting an eye, that wasn't at all surprising. Holst was the strongest fighter Hilda had ever seen, and she doubted that would ever change. "I'm fine," Hilda assured him, her voice coming out far stronger than she could have ever expected. She took in a deep breath to fully stabilize herself before she slashed her axe sideways at another soldier that tried to catch her by surprise while she was distracted with talking to Holst. The soldier groaned in pain and fell to the ground a moment later. Hilda was quick to take him out of the fight permanently with another slash of her axe, though she averted her eyes at the last second to make sure she didn't accidentally catch a glimpse of any unnecessary gore. Holst let out a small chuckle at the sight of the soldier she had so effortlessly crushed. "You've gotten stronger since going to the officers' academy. In fact, I might start to think you're not my helpless little sister anymore if you keep that up," he remarked. Hilda resisted the urge to scoff at that, instead just turning her attention back to the fight. She didn't have time to talk to Holst, and she knew that whether she wanted to admit it or not, there was still work to be done, and as much as she liked pushing her work off to others, she knew she wouldn't be able to rest until she pulled her own weight. There were too many invaders for her to leave her share of the battle for others to take care of. She would have to step up whether she wanted to or not. Before Hilda could say anything in response to Holst though, her attention was turned up to the sky as a shadow blocked out her view of the sun for a moment. She held up her axe on instinct, thinking a wyvern was going to try and swoop down on her the instant she let her guard down, but nothing of the sort happened. Instead, the wyvern just kept flying, seemingly targeting another part of the fort. Something about this wyvern caught Hilda's attention more than the other attackers though, and she found herself staring at the silhouette of the beast and its rider for far longer than she realistically could have afforded in the heat of a fight. The wyvern was much larger than the others Hilda had seen previously, and that had to mean something. She knew enough about combat to be able to conclude that the person on that wyvern was likely a leader or commander of some kind in the enemy army. She didn't know who it was specifically, but she knew they were important, and that had to count for something. Hilda seemed to be the only one in the dark though, as when Holst caught a glimpse of the wyvern overhead, he let out a small hum of a frown before twisting his grip on his blade and starting to walk away. "I'm off to handle the commander. Do what you can to keep the main gate under control," Holst instructed. He didn't even give Hilda the chance to object before he ran off, and Hilda sputtered after him before realizing it was pointless. Once she was left without her brother, Hilda sighed and turned her attention back to the nearby gate. She didn't like her circumstances at all, but complaining about it wasn't going to get her anywhere no matter how much she wanted to wait until all of this ended and come out of hiding once she was sure she was safe. Instead, her best course of action was to just keep fighting and get out of this that way. That would at least do something productive for her even if she hated the idea of combat. Hilda wanted to follow her brother, but she knew better than to disobey his orders. He was the seasoned commander out of the two of them, and if he told her to do something, then she would follow his instructions. With this in mind, she returned to the gate and slashed her axe in a wide arc to try and deflect a spear hit coming in her direction. Lawrence swept in at the last minute to finish off the Almiran soldier before they could strike back at her, and Hilda glanced over to him gratefully before she got back to the fight. She knew Holst would be able to handle himself even if she would have preferred to continue fighting at his side for as long as she could get away with it. As long as he told her to stay behind though, Hilda was going to follow his directions. He knew what he was doing, and he wouldn't have given her those instructions without purpose. Even if she didn't like it, she would do it. After all, she trusted Holst more than anyone. He would never dare to let her down. Lysithea ducked beneath a sword slash that came soaring down on her from above before she released an explosion of dark magic that rocked the ground beneath her feet. She followed that up with another magical attack, this time utilizing the light element, before she sighed and pulled away from the wyvern rider that nearly spiraled into her. Another quick blast of light magic was enough to keep the wyvern from getting onto the ground level of the fort, and when Lysithea glanced up, she was met with the sight of Marianne. The blue-haired girl had one hand extended out in front of her body, and it was clear that she was the one who had cast the spell. Marianne was trembling slightly, but she did her best to hide it for the sake of not drawing the attention of any enemy soldiers. The last thing they could afford was having an Almiran general take advantage of any perceived weaknesses, after all. The overhead wyvern riders were starting to thin out, and Lysithea was beyond relieved for that. She couldn't tell if this was just a lull in the battle or if the enemy reinforcements were finally slowing down, but she would have taken either one. Lysithea had never been the most physically fit due to circumstances out of her control, but she was really starting to wish she had at least put a bit more effort into strengthening her lungs for this battle specifically. The locket was massive, and she was constantly scrambling around to try and find the best vantage point from which to attack the enemy wyvern riders. Her magic didn't have the range arrows did, so she needed to be careful with her positioning. Unfortunately, that meant she was running around much more than she was used to, and her chest was starting to burn with hatred in response. Lysithea had long since lost track of how long the battle had been raging, but she could only assume it had been at least an hour. She was appropriately drained for how she would feel over an hour of constant combat without any breaks, and she hoped it ended soon. Lysithea was a powerful mage, but the locket didn't agree with her fighting style at all. If this kept up, she was going to end up practically collapsing into her bed once the battle ended. The worst part about all of this was the fact that Lysithea had no idea where the enemy commanders were. She could only assume there were a few generals leading an army of this size, but none of them had made themselves known yet. In some ways, this was a relief. Lysithea knew she personally wouldn't have been able to handle any other soldiers trying to come down on her position from above, much less a commander. In many other ways though, the fact that she hadn't seen the leaders of this army was beyond concerning. They must have been planning something if they had stayed hidden for this long, and Lysithea was terrified of what that could mean. The mere idea terrified her to her core whether she wanted to admit it or not. As if on cue, a massive shadow flew through the skies overhead, and Lysithea threw up her arms to defend herself on instinct. The shadow came and went without trying to attack her though, and Lysithea was fine with that. She saw the outline of the massive wyvern that had cast the shadow to begin with as it flew through the clouds, and everything clicked together at last. The first commander among the enemy's ranks had made themselves known. And as far as Lysithea could tell, they were making a beeline for the central stronghold at the back of the fortress. Lysithea snarled under her breath at that. If the Almiran army managed to claim Fodlan's side of the locket, then they would be able to use that to their advantage to not only clear out the rest of the fortress but then strike at Leicester. There would be no reinforcements coming to help the Alliance army as had been stated many times leading up to this battle, so if the commander was able to take that stronghold, the fight was as good as lost. That would be the end of the Fodlan's locket, and by extension, it would likely spell the end of the Leicester alliance in a matter of weeks. Before Lysithea had the chance to react though, she was cut off by the sound of footfall from nearby. She turned to see Holst dashing past her, his sword already in his hands as he prepared for the next segment of the battle. Lysithea stared at him for a long moment, but she didn't say anything as he dashed away. Instead, she paid attention to the way Holst was staring at the shadow of the massive wyvern that had flown overhead just a few moments prior. From there, it was easy enough for her to conclude that he was trying to make it to the commander for the sake of ending the battle as soon as possible. Lysithea had no reason to complain about that. If anyone would be able to handle the leader of the enemy army, it would be him. She had heard countless stories of Holst's achievements in combat, and she knew better than to try an object when he set his sights on winning the battle. Instead of chasing him, she shook off her concerns to the best of her ability and forced herself to look at the other wyverns swooping through the sky. If Holst was to handle the commander of the enemy forces, then the rest of the army would need to hold off the reinforcements before they could claim the upper hand. Marianne seemed shocked to see Holst run by, but she recovered from her surprise just in time to dodge an attack coming down on her from above. A wyvern rider had noticed Holst coming through the area and had tried to take advantage of the distraction to defeat both Lysithea and Marianne. While Marianne was distracted with avoiding the strike, Lysithea let out a blast of darkness that shook the ground at her feet but defeated the wyvern rider easily. He didn't bother waiting around for her to attack again, instead forcing his steed into the sky and flying away as soon as he had gathered his bearings. Lysithea was halfway tempted to try and chase him down for his transgressions against her, but she forced herself to stay where she was. She let out a stiff sigh of irritation before turning back to the rest of the battle. She couldn't afford to get caught up in her other worries. She had a fight to win, and she needed to focus. As far as Lysithea could tell, there had to be at least one other commander leading an army of this size. She somehow doubted the enemy army's leader would have just abandoned their forces to try and rush the central stronghold if they didn't have some other plan in mind. There was no doubt another commander hiding in the back of the invading forces, and they were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Lysithea needed to turn her attention to defeating as many of the attackers swarming after her in the meantime. She wouldn't be able to defeat any commanders if she was too caught up in fighting off the reinforcements when they arrived. Lysithea glanced to the sky once again and saw a few wyvern riders moving toward another region of the fortress, no doubt trying to take advantage of a weak point. She wanted to chase them so she could bring the riders to their knees herself, but she knew she couldn't just leave Marianne alone to handle the rampart they were currently standing on. She needed to choose the best option rather than the one she would have preferred. It was frustrating, yes, but what other choice did she have? After all of this ended though, Lysithea was going to enjoy the best day off ever. She had earned it, and the battle wasn't even halfway over. What a pain. Claude knocked another arrow and released it as quickly as his fingers could possibly move. He was trying his best to stay focused, but he was admittedly a bit rattled by the invading army. He had been aware of the massive military force Almira touted as its proudest achievement, but somehow, knowing about it and fighting it were two different things. This was the largest attack since the construction of the locket, just as Holst had said, and Claude could feel it. He had seen a shadow moving overhead previously to indicate that Nader had joined the fight. Claude would recognize the silhouette of Nader's wyvern any day of the week, and that remained true even now. Claude knew he couldn't afford to chase after Nader though. He was positioned in this precise location for a reason, and he couldn't leave it unless he wanted to leave the fortress open to even more reinforcements from the air. They were at enough of a disadvantage as it was, and Claude wasn't going to be the one to make that worse. He was admittedly a bit curious about everything else he was faced with though. He didn't know where Shahid was, but he knew it was just a matter of time before he saw his brother again. He had to be there somewhere. Claude knew his brother sought glory above all else, and this fight had his trademark written all over it. He didn't know if he would have been able to talk Shahid out of continuing to fight, but he had to at least try. Would Shahid even recognize him? That was the real question, whether Claude wanted to admit it or not. Shahid had never even cast his brother a second look if he could avoid it, and years had passed since Claude left Almira to live in Leicester. Perhaps Shahid had tried to block him out of his memory to the degree of not even recognizing him after they reunited so many years later. It wouldn't have even shocked Claude if Shahid looked at him and didn't remember who he was at all. He didn't know if it would offend him, but it was something for him to think about later on. After all, he would have his answers about Shahid's thoughts on him before the day ended. It was just a matter of time before they crossed paths in Beauce. Claude looked up at the skies once again, and he saw a few wyvern riders streaking in his direction. He shouldn't have been surprised to hear the Almiran army was targeting him specifically. After all, if they wanted to lay claim to Leicester, the best way for them to do it would have been to kill the heir in the midst of their invasion. If anything, Claude was shocked it hadn't come to this sooner. At the very least, he knew how to defend himself from the wyverns coming in his direction. He hadn't chosen to train himself in archery for this purpose, but he was glad for the choice he had made all those years ago. Claude sent another arrow out before he dodged an axe swipe that threatened to cut his arm right at the shoulder. The Almirans fought just as fiercely as he had heard, but that didn't mean he was going to give up easily. He would live through this battle and go forward to pursue his ambitions. That much was a promise. Not even Shahid's attack could change his mind on that. Unfortunately, Shahid didn't want to hold back during this fight, so Claude would just have to give it his all. Now that the enemy forces had realized who he was though, that was bound to be a lot harder from that point forward. The best he could do for the moment was to avoid any attacks that came his way, though that remained much easier said than done. At the very least, he could count on the others to fight with fewer obstacles. They knew how to handle themselves in a fight whether they realized it or not, and even if he was distracted, and he knew the others would be able to take care of this without him. Claude didn't like leaving the fighting to other people, but at this point, he had few options. To put it simply, he couldn't wait for the day when he could finally talk about this with Shahid. One day, it would hopefully be a very funny story to tell to all their friends. Unfortunately, today was not that day, and Claude rolled out of the way of another lance strike to prove it. Holst had fought against the forces of Almira countless times since his first trip to the Locket years prior. He had been trained in combat for the purpose of fighting off any invaders that tried to cross over the border, and he held that duty close to his chest with all the pride in the world. His work had never been easy, but he was proud of it, and he would do anything and everything in his power to ensure the prolonged safety of his friends and family. At the moment, the journey to help others led Holst through the center of the fortress to a wide open space just in front of the main stronghold of the Locket. He knew Nader was going to take the bait. The two of them had fought countless times as well, and they knew exactly how to get on one another's nerves or push the other to their limit. The Golden Deer, as much as Holst appreciated their help, were inexperienced and didn't know what a fight like this could bring. That meant he would simply have to take care of Nader and make a plan for what to do after the fact. Sure enough, Nader brought his wyvern down to the ground just in front of Holst. He had known they would fight that day, and in fact, he seemed prepared for it. Nader had a smile on his face to show that despite the situation around them, he welcomed being able to challenge Holst to combat once again. They had always ended their battles in a draw, but Holst intended to change that today. The people of Leicester were counting on him, after all, and he was hardly one to back down from a challenge. Well, if it isn't Nader the Unstoppable. Are you ready to settle the score? Holst asked with a grin of his own. In truth, they weren't settling their score as much as finally finding a victor. They had been lacking in any notable win counter ever since they first started fighting one another. After all, it was hard to put any tallies on the board when every battle they fought ended in a draw. Nader's smile slipped away immediately, and he let out an exasperated sigh. For the last time, it's Nader the Undefeated, and I know you're doing that on purpose. He shouted at Holst above the chaos that surrounded them. He was right about Holst doing it on purpose. In all honesty, Holst found it funny to see Nader glare and sputter at him for getting his title wrong so many times. It was part of their routine of fighting each other, and he wasn't going to abandon it no matter how much Nader wanted him to move on and find another opening joke. Maybe I am, Holst replied with a loose shrug, never willing to admit to what he was doing. It wasn't as if he had to in the first place, Nader already knew. But that doesn't matter much now, does it? We have a battle to take care of. I'm afraid I can't let you step any further into the alliance. I'll have you know that I don't particularly want to step into the alliance, Nader said, his voice shockingly honest given the circumstances. In fact, I would prefer it if we could end this battle without a need to come to blows. Unfortunately, the prince has decided he has other plans. I don't know much about the Prince of Almira, Holst confessed. Perhaps you would be open to telling me more about him after this battle ends. I feel information would be the perfect prize for me finally besting you after all this time. Nader let out a hearty laugh at that as he shook his head. I know you've got a reputation in Leicester, but that doesn't mean you'll be able to find as much sway in Almira. I'm going to finally win our old war. Even if I don't want to fight in this battle, I have my pride to take care of, and I'd be a fool to let this chance go when it's right there waiting for me, he told Holst. Suit yourself. Holst settled into a defensive position, his sword braced for the battle to come. He had an advantage over Nader thanks to his weapon type, but he knew that wasn't going to mean much in the long run. He had maintained the same advantage over Nader throughout all their past encounters as well, and that had never been enough for him to claim victory. Nader was simply too powerful for Holst to stand a chance him as things stood at the moment. But that had never stopped Holst before. Even if Nader didn't want to fight, he had involved himself with the battle regardless, and that meant Holst would have to fend him off. If the central stronghold of the Locket was taken by Almiran forces, then they would no doubt spread throughout the rest of the fort to wipe out the Leicester army before moving on to the rest of the country. Nader's desires meant little in comparison to his actions, and Holst knew exactly where this was going to take him. Nader felt much the same way, and he adjusted his grip on his axe slightly. It spoke volumes to their strange rapport that they could wait for the proper moment to strike in the midst of a fight like this, though nobody else would ever quite understand it. They didn't need to. As long as Holst could fend Nader off and keep him from claiming the Locket for the sake of his prince, Holst was fine with not being understood. And so, he charged off to battle once again, his blade flashing in the midday sunshine. One way or another, he would defeat Nader, and if all went well, that would leave the rest of the army to wipe out the rest of the army. As long as Lester was kept safe, they would be fine, and all it began with this moment. Chapter 25, Brothers and Blades. Nader came down on Holst from above, his axe gleaming all the while. Holst threw up his blade to deflect the strike. Nader retreated a few seconds later, and he pulled into the sky as the wings of his wyvern flapped. Holst looked up at him with a light frown. Nader was holding back on him. He wasn't giving the fight anywhere near as much energy and passion as he should have been. He was going through the motions at this point, and Holst knew it. Holst didn't have the chance to say that out loud though. Instead, he dodged another swing coming in his direction before following up with an upward slash. He launched himself off the ground before slicing down toward the ground with hopes of dragging Nader to the stone floor of the locket. Nader would not be so easily swayed though, and he maintained his airborne position slightly off the ground even as Holst landed again. Holst halfway expected to look up at Nader to see him smiling, but instead, he was met with no enthusiasm at all from his opponent. There was nothing of note to be seen there, just a blank expression that spoke of just how little Nader wanted to be there. "Where's your fire, Nader?" Holst asked with a light smirk. "I understand not wanting to fight, but you're not even making this entertaining for us. The least you can do is make it a little bit fun." Nader shrugged. "I'd rather not make this any harder for you than I need to. I don't want to invade Lester, and at the moment, our king doesn't either. The only one with an interest in that is the prince, and it's just a matter of time before he realizes that nobody else wants to do this either. You must have noticed just how apathetic everyone is." Holst nodded slowly. He had indeed noticed that. He had been able to fight off the attacking Almiran soldiers too easily. Sure, the invaders were strong enough to give the Golden Deer at least a bit of a run for their money, but that wasn't saying much given how they had only just started their time at the Officers' Academy. Holst knew what the Almiran soldiers were usually like when they fought in the pursuit of glory and pride, and this was far from what he had grown used to over the years. "Why are you fighting if none of your men are interested in this battle?" Holst questioned. "You want nothing to do with this, and it doesn't seem like any of your allies do either. I have to wonder why you're here at all. Would you refuse a request from a member of the royal family of your country?" Nader countered. Holst hesitated, and that was the only answer Nader needed to see. "Exactly. I have no passion for this battle, but I know we have to fight for the sake of the prince. He won't let us retreat without at least putting up a fight against all of you. Your soldiers are hoping they'll find a bit more passion for the fight as it goes on," Holst realized. "You know that's not going to happen though. You know you're going against what the king wanted by following the prince's orders, and what happens next? Everyone has to wonder what that will be, don't they? I'm not going to storm into your country and try to tear it apart if that's what you're wondering," Nader said. "It wouldn't be right. Perhaps that will be the desire of the whole royal family one day. But for the time being, we don't need to be as firmly opposed as you believe. Either way, I know what I have to do. I need to defend my home, and if that means fighting you, then so be it," Holst smiled. "And if I have you distracted, then that means my forces can win this fight. After all, that seems to be what you want, and I'm not going to put myself in the way of that." Nader sighed. "You don't need to make it quite so obvious," he muttered. "But I need to make it look as difficult for you as possible. If you're done with monologuing, the least you can do is try to give the rest of your forces an apparent advantage from fighting me." Holst laughed at that. "If you insist. I look forward to seeing which one of us will win. Not that it will count as long as you're holding back. One of these days, I intend to defeat you on my own terms when we're both fighting with everything we have. Until then, I hope you're looking forward to returning home with your tail tucked between your legs." "We'll just have to see," Nader scoffed. "We'll certainly see." Claude let out a heavy sigh as he finally managed to fend off the last of the wyvern riders bombarding his location in the fortress. His lungs were starting to burn from the constant evasion, and he was really starting to wish he had put a bit more effort into pushing his limits physically when training. Claude was hardly out of shape, but he definitely wasn't as strong as he could have been, and he could see it all too clearly now. He let out a careful breath once he was sure he was in the clear, knocking another arrow just to be ready when he was next attacked. Claude had started to notice a few details about the ways in which the enemy forces fought, and he was slowly realizing just how little this fight mattered in the eyes of the people on the other end. The Amirans fought well, and they were all overwhelmingly powerful, but that meant little given the fact that none of them seemed to care about what they were doing. If anything, it was like they were just going through the motions. They were strong, but they didn't seem to care about the battle at all. In fact, they were targeting Claude more out of obligation than anything else. They were going after him because they knew they needed to fight for the sake of the one who was commanding them. The lack of enemy spirit was only further confirmation that Claude was going to end up facing Shahid before the day ended. Shahid was firm when he gave orders, never taking any objections or offering any room for people to push back against him. He wouldn't have allowed his allies to try and object to his commands regardless of how little they really wanted to be there. Whether that was a boon or a bane was hardly something for Claude to decide, but he wasn't going to complain at all about being given an extra benefit during this battle. Claude glanced up for a moment when he was in the clear, watching the shadows swirl overhead. None of the Wyvern riders were diving after him at the moment, giving Claude all the time he needed to come up with a strategy. The reinforcements had slowed down, and Nader was seemingly out of the picture given the fact that Claude hadn't seen him flying around anywhere. That meant the Leicester army was just waiting for Shahid to show himself at this point. Claude did his best to shove his nerves aside at the thought of seeing his brother again. He was normally above getting nervous before a fight, but when it came to Shahid, there was his greatest weakness, he supposed, not that he would ever let anyone know the truth. After all, nobody else in the army knew the truth about his connection to Shahid, and Claude was hoping they would never need to find out until the moment he was ready to share it with them on his own terms. He was desperate for Shahid to not recognize him as a matter of fact, knowing that if his brother did remember what he looked like, he would be in for a world of trouble and a long list of explanations. Even if Shahid called him Khalid, the rest of the group would be curious, and Claude didn't want to deal with that at all if he could avoid it. Luckily for him, he didn't need to wait long to figure out if Shahid was going to recognize him or not. Another prominent silhouette of an enemy wyvern blocked out the sun for a few seconds, and Claude knew who the rider was going to be as soon as the shadows swallowed him. The wyvern curled around toward the ground at that, and Claude caught a glimpse of his brother for the first time in years. Shahid's face was far older than Claude remembered it being, though that made sense. Beyond that, Shahid wore a prideful smirk and a scoff. His eyes didn't flash with recognition at the sight of his brother, and Claude was beyond relieved for that. Shahid instead just raised his axe with that dark smile on his face, preparing to bring the weapon down the instant he was given a reason to do so. Claude just let out a whistle. "I guess that settles what I'll be doing next," he muttered. It was hardly the best way for him to open up a fight, but he didn't want to risk speaking openly to Shahid at the moment. Claude's voice had deepened considerably since he was last in Almira, but he still didn't want to risk Shahid recognizing the sound of his voice. It was just a matter of time before the other members of the Golden Deer came after him to try and help him to fight off Shahid, and the last thing he needed was for them to end up distracted by their confusion at Shahid's reaction to him. Shahid looked at Claude from top to bottom, scrutinizing him for a few seconds longer than Claude expected him to. Shahid was clearly trying to figure out who Claude was and what he was trying to accomplish, and his confusion was written all over his face when he couldn't figure it out. His gaze never flashed with recognition, thank the goddess, but his features did twist to irritation and frustration after a few seconds. He pulled himself back into the sky before coming down against Claude, his axe primed at the ready. Claude rolled out of the way as quickly as he could, letting his arrow fly free once he came up in a crouch again a moment later. Shahid swerved out of the way at the last moment, but that did nothing to help Claude's case. If anything, that only increased Shahid's disdain as he looked down at his brother. Claude's heart screamed in his chest with every hope in the world that he wouldn't be recognized. Luckily for him, Shahid didn't recognize him at all. Instead, he just let out a snort. "I thought I recognized you. You look just like my horror of a little brother." He snapped at Claude, his eyes dark with a vitriolic glare. Even if Shahid didn't recognize Claude and just thought he looked similar to the Khalid he once knew, the sight of someone looking so much like his brother was enough to upset Shahid. It made him fight harder for the sake of taking out his frustrations. Claude shouldn't have been surprised, but he knew even so that this was going to be something he would have to think about in extensive detail later. With no other choice but to respond, Claude offered a sly smile in Shahid's direction. "Then for your brother's sake and my own, it's time to put you in your place." He waited for a moment to see if Shahid figured out who he was after hearing his voice, but luckily for him, Shahid's expression never changed. Claude prepared another arrow before letting it fly up at Shahid, clipping his wyvern on the wing. Shahid's mount barely seemed to notice the attack though, instead just continuing to beat his wings against the air as if nothing had happened at all. Claude resisted the urge to cringe at the sight of his arrow barely dealing any damage at all, but he shoved his worries down as far as possible. He would be fine. He had to be. All he had to do was wait for the other golden deer to get there to help him out. He knew at least one of them had to be available. Right? Surely they had seen Shahid coming after him. They had to be willing to come to his aid. Claude normally knew better than to count on others to bail him out of a bad situation, but at this point, he knew he had no other choice. He would put up as much of a fight against Shahid until the others were able to come and help him. He owed himself that much, and he wasn't going to shy away from that. Claude was still exhausted from the length of the fight and just how much dodging he had been forced to do, but he would give it his all even so. He had no other choice if he wanted to get out of this alive. Even if he didn't want to hurt Shahid, he knew that was a one-way road, and Claude wasn't going to shy away from the truth. He would be fine. He would avoid every attack that came his way no matter what it took. Claude would just have to count on the others to come and help him out as soon as possible. It was hardly the best situation to be in, but he would figure it out. After all, he had gotten out of far worse situations than this. He would be okay. Right? Leonie let out a heavy sigh as she let her bow fall from its position at its prime. She had been shooting down as many wyverns as possible from the ground level of the fortress, but her energy was quickly abandoning her. Leonie liked to think she could handle herself in a fight, but that did little to fix the way her entire body ached from exertion. She had been training fiercely since going to the officers' academy, but that wasn't enough to save her now, it seemed. She needed to keep getting better if she wanted to be able to handle herself in a fight like this. Leonie gave herself a moment to breathe, her lungs expanding and emptying rapidly. She had been granted a brief break in the onslaught of reinforcements, and she was going to milk it for all it was worth. She could get back into the fight once she had recovered her breath and her energy. At the very least, that had been her original plan. However, it all fell apart when she saw another particularly prominent shadow fly through the sky above her. She knew without needing to ask for confirmation that the other commander had shown himself at long last. Leonie had no idea if that was supposed to be a good sign or not, since on one hand, it could spell the end of the battle, but on the other, it could be the enemy general coming in for the kill. Ignatz was exhausted nearby as well, and he was leaning carefully against the nearby wall as he tried to restore his energy. Shamir was the only one among their trio who didn't seem at all bothered by the prolonged fighting, and only a few beads of sweat across her forehead showed how far she had been pushing herself. Still, she was quick to snap right back into her previous preparedness for battle, knocking yet another arrow and darting off in the direction of the enemy commander. She didn't even spare a word in Ignatz and Leonie's direction as she left, and all the two students could do was stare. Leonie wanted to say something to bring Shamir back to her side, but she only figured out that she needed to speak up after the mercenary had already rounded the nearest corner to continue chasing down the wyvern rider in the overhead skies. Leonie let out a heavy sigh as she carefully nocked another arrow for herself. She was exhausted and knew she wasn't going to be able to fight all that much longer, but if she didn't give this fight her all, she was going to end up regretting it. What was she going to do or say if the entirety of Leicester was invaded because she didn't put up enough of a fight here today? She would just have to push on for a little bit longer no matter how much her body wanted to kill her for it. Leonie flashed a brief glance over at Ignatz to see if he had anything to say about all of this, but unsurprisingly, he was too winded to bother with forming words. He let out an irritated and exhausted wheeze before he pulled another arrow from his quiver and started off in the same direction Shamir had vanished in. Leonie was quick to trail after him, not wasting a moment even as her legs burned with hatred for her going so far in such a short time frame. She had to keep moving for the sake of Lester. She could figure out the details of how she was going to bounce back from this later. In the meantime, she just needed to stay alive. She just wished that didn't involve rushing straight into danger instead of running away from it. The front gate of the locket was significantly less crowded than it had been when the battle began, and Hilda was glad for it. She needed a break, and she took a step back to try and recover her breath as soon as she was given the chance. Raphael gladly filled the hole she had left behind in the battlefield, and Hilda made a mental note to thank him for that later. As it stood, she didn't have the energy nor the lung capacity to send him her thanks in the middle of the fight. It would just have to wait a little bit longer. Hilda was honestly proud of how long she had lasted even if the battle showed no signs of letting up. She had heard countless stories of just how strong the Amirans were, but she was still holding her own despite it all. That was something for her to take pride in even if she wished it wasn't something she needed to worry about in the first place. She was still in one piece, and that was what she cared about most. A shadow had passed over the entrance of the locket about 2 minutes prior, and Hilda had known exactly what it was supposed to mean for her. The commander had finally come out of hiding for the sake of trying to win the fight. Well, the second leader of the Almiran forces had stepped into the light. Holst was already taking care of one of the two generals leading this onslaught, leaving just the other commander for the Golden Deer to handle. Hilda couldn't afford to run after the general though. None of the people blocking the front gate could. She, Lawrence, and Raphael were desperately needed in order to hold the main line, and Hilda wasn't going to neglect her duty. The battle at the front of the fortress was finally starting to let up, and she couldn't just leave when she had earned the break she had fought for so desperately at long last. Hilda heaved her axe up on her shoulder again, letting out a heavy sigh along the way. She wanted to spend all her time just standing around and resting until she was feeling ready to enter the fight again, but she knew she wasn't going to have that option. She had to keep fighting whether she wanted to or not, and she knew that she firmly fell into the latter category. Still, if the Almiran ground forces managed to get into the locket, they were going to rush toward the other side of the border, and Hilda knew she couldn't let that happen. She would have to crash and rest after all of this was over, but in the meantime, she would need to fight. For a moment, Hilda wished with everything she had that there were multiple copies of her brother. That would certainly make handling this battle a lot easier. The fact of the matter was that there was only one of him though, so she would just have to push forward even without him. The front gate wasn't going to hold itself, and Hilda wasn't going to back down when she knew she was needed. She may have disliked combat, but she knew better than to do something that ridiculous. After this battle ended though, Hilda was expecting as much compensation as possible. She had earned it already, and the fight wasn't even over. What a pain in the neck. Claude was quick to dodge an attack from Shahid by rolling out of the way just in time, coming up in a crouch before he released another arrow. He was careful to not target his brother directly, knowing that would do nothing but hurt him in the long run. Instead, Claude hoped to debilitate Shahid's wyvern just enough to send him back to the other side of the border. He knew he wasn't going to be able to win in a fight as things were, not that he particularly wanted to harm Shahid anyway, so he would just have to play his cards creatively until the other Golden Deer arrived to bail him out. Even if it wasn't a perfect plan, Claude was willing to try it. What other choice did he have? Shahid didn't give Claude much time to recover though, and he slashed his blade roughly in his opponent's direction. Claude had been trying to grab another arrow, but his fingers barely missed his quiver, leaving him distracted when Shahid struck. Claude threw his bow up at the last second to try and deflect the brunt of the attack, and luckily for him, it worked. At least to an extent. Claude was sent sliding backwards, his shoes scraping roughly against the stony ground of the locket. His balance was immediately sent spiraling out of his favor, and he knew what was coming before Shahid even started to move. Sure enough, Shahid raised his axe high above his head once again, preparing to bring it down while Claude was disoriented and unable to easily swerve out of the way. Claude turned his attention off to Shahid's right before he pushed off the ground with as much force as he could muster. His escape was admittedly graceless and only did more damage to his already struggling sense of balance, but at least he was able to get out of there in time. He was still alive, and all of his limbs were still attached to his body. That was something he needed to be grateful for, even though he wished it didn't need to be a question at all. Before Claude could worry too much about Shahid chasing after him again though, an arrow slammed straight into the wing of Shahid's wyvern. The draconic mount let out a cry of pain and thrashed around in a desperate attempt to dislodge the arrow. Shahid was nearly thrown from his saddle along the way, and he clung tight to his steed's neck in a desperate bid to keep from being sent to the ground. Shahid shouted some instruction to his wyvern to try and get it under control once again, but Claude didn't pay any attention to what his brother was saying. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder to see just who had come to his rescue. He already had a snarky remark primed at the tip of his tongue, but it fell short when he realized it was Shamir who had come to help him. Claude knew she would appreciate his sharp sense of humor considerably less than the other golden deer, and he wasn't going to push his luck when she had already come to his rescue in his time of need. Instead, he just took the time Shamir had given him with her distraction to focus his energy and ground himself once again. He needed to maintain as much concentration as possible if he was going to get out of this in one piece, especially with how difficult Shahid was making it for him. Claude sent another arrow flying at Shahid soon afterward, and the Prince of Almira swerved out of the way at the last second. His eyes were alight with rage now, and he raised his axe high before going to strike at Claude once again. Even if he didn't realize he was fighting his brother, the resemblance Shahid saw to Khalid was enough to spark a fire of hatred deep in the pit of his stomach. Unfortunately for him though, Claude had regained his bearings thanks to Shamir bailing him out for a few seconds, and he was easily able to roll out of the way without any worries at all. When Claude rose to his full height once again, he was pleasantly surprised to see that Shamir was far from being the only reinforcement that had come to help him. Leone and Ignatz both released arrows at Shahid as soon as they were within his range, and Shahid let out a snarl of irritation as he was forced into the sky once again. He wouldn't be able to dodge the arrows at such a close proximity, and he knew it. He wouldn't be able to attack without getting in close, but he wouldn't be able to avoid any attacks that came his way if he went after Claude directly. Shahid knew he had been pushed back, though he absolutely hated to admit it. In fact, Shahid seemed to hate it so much that he was glad to shout an irritated cry in Claude's direction as he tried to figure out what to do next. "I won't lose to you rats," he shouted. Claude just offered him a sideways smirk, practically challenging Shahid to try and come after him once again. As long as Claude had the backup of 3 other archers, he was as good as safe. Just as he had known they would, the golden deer had come to his rescue, and he couldn't have been happier for it. Shahid still had a bit of brazen confidence left in him though, and he swooped through the skies before trying to come back toward Claude for another attack. Claude sent an arrow flying in Shahid's direction, purposefully aiming just to the right of his brother's head. Shahid avoided the strike at the last possible second, and he returned to the skies with rage boiling in his eyes. Claude knocked another arrow and pointed it at Shahid, not releasing it but making sure the threat was still there. Shahid wouldn't be able to get any closer without risking his life, and he knew better than to push his luck when he had been defeated. "I would make my escape if I were you," Claude called out to Shahid. "You're not gonna like what comes next." It was an empty threat since he had no intentions of actually attacking his brother now that Shahid was on the ropes, but Shahid didn't need to know that. As long as he thought there was a chance he could be defeated, Shahid would know better than to try and strike once again. Before Shahid had the chance to retort, a massive shadow passed through the skies overhead. Claude spared a glance at the silhouette out of the corner of his eye, and he realized with a light smirk that Nader had been fended off by Holst. Shahid had lost, and there was no way for him to run from that fact now. Shahid's only option at this point was to retreat back to Almira no matter how little he wanted to admit it. Shahid looked back down to Claude, his glare only intensifying when he saw the smirk his foe was wearing. "You swine! Turn that loathsome face from my sight. In every way, you remind me of my wretch of a brother. I will be the end of you one day, I promise you that." With that, Shahid turned around and forced his wyvern to take wing once again. Slowly but surely, his outline grew smaller upon the horizon until there were no signs of him having been there at all. The other Almiran soldiers still in the locket were quick to follow suit when they saw both Shahid and Nader retreating, and just like that, the battle was over. Claude only let his bow fall when he was sure Shahid wasn't going to try and turn around once again. He maintained his proud smile all the while, though it was more for the sake of Leone and Ignatz than his own sense of satisfaction. He didn't want them to see just how tired he was after that battle, not that he could hide it forever. He had won this fight, and he wanted to relish in that for as long as possible. Shahid was gone, and the rest of his allies were as well. The Golden Deer had successfully held off the attackers from Almira. They had maintained the locket, and Lester would live to see another day. The battle had been long and bitter, but they had come out on top. That was something for them to take pride in, and Claude was going to relish in it for as long as he possibly could. He had earned this. All of them had. More importantly, they had all earned a nap, and Claude couldn't wait. Check the description for the links to the author.